The coconut nut is a giant nut. If you eat too much, you get very...
In the world of the New Order, the Axis powers triumphed over the Allies in the Second World War. France was crushed, Operation Sea Lion was successful, the Soviet Union was destroyed in Operation Barbarossa, and, most importantly, Pearl Harbor was bombed with atomic might by the Japanese. Though things couldn't be perfect forever. Italy would split with Germany in the 50s, fearing further expansionism from the Reich, instead opting to form the triumvirate with Iberia and Turkey. On top of this, the Reich was hit with a horrid recession around 1950, one which Germany, along with the rest of the Einheitspact alongside it, struggled for years to recover from. Worst of all, the year of 1955 saw the beginning of the West Russian War, with the shattered Soviet remnant states banding together to make an attempt at liberating Russia once and for all. Whilst the war ultimately ended in favor of the Reich, the already strained German economy suffered even more. Yet, finally, by 1962, things were looking up. On January 19th, the Reichskriegsflagge would be planted on the moon, with the German Reich being the first nation to successfully land a man on the lunar world. This calm did not last long. On January 25th of that same year, the Führer was nearly the victim of an assassination carried out by the vile Japanese Empire. While he survived, he was forced to come to terms with his own mortality. Hitler was ailing, his health declining rapidly. On February 1st, he would hold a speech making his final decision. The successor to his rule, the man who would carry the legacy of the Reich, would be Albert Speer, the ardent reformer who believed that to truly survive, the Reich had to soften. Not to release the grip, but to loosen it enough to give the veil of freedom. As was expected, the other candidates for the succession of the Reich, Martin Bormann and Reinhard Heydrich, would be up in arms about the decision, and a power struggle would quickly begin in the background of the government, with the three, as well as Göring, vying for influence to secure their control over the Reich after Hitler's passing. Not long after the declaration of the successor to the Reich, universities and students would break out in protests towards it, citing the overarching power of the police state and the lack of change within the system as their grievances. Whilst Heydrich and Göring claimed that the protests needed to be crushed with military might, and Bormann couldn't care less, Speer believed that the protests needed to be handled with peace. His first action as successor was to reel in the Orpo, weakening the police state just a little. Enough to calm the protests, not enough to liberate the people. With his handling of the student protests, his legitimacy and influence would increase, with Bormann and Heydrich being forced to admit begrudgingly that Speer's policy of peace had worked. From there, Speer would work to continue his policy of reformism, expanding his influence whilst keeping it moderated enough that the conservative and hardliner elements within the Reich would not protest his movements. Speer would reach out to the Wehrmacht, gaining the favor of reformist officers within the army, cracking down on SS recruitment to limit Heydrich's influence. He would also spend time working with major members of the earlier student protests, promising a better future under a Reich headed by Speer, pushing a pension improvement through the Reichstag, and engaging in rapprochement with the United States. Things were not sunshine and rainbows, however. The Reich, although finding some sense of stability under Speer's reform, was coming under pressure from anti-Reich influences across the globe. Their stronghold in the Americas, the Dominican Republic, was undergoing unrest. Joint pressure from Cuba and the United States had formed the Caribbean Legion, attempting to destroy Rafael Trujillo's authority. This, obviously, was unacceptable. Hitler was convinced by the successors of the Reich to send tip-top technology to the Dominican Republic, as well as attempts to shatter the intelligence of the United States. Luckily, these joint efforts, alongside some aid from the Iberian Union, would allow Trujillo to force back the Caribbean Legion, securing his rule over the island. History will absolve them. Another pain in the Reich's side was the Malagasy Revolt. Long under the control of French Madagascar, the island had suddenly fallen under attack by Japanese forces and natives attempting to overthrow local order on the island. While this would be a brief shock, support from the French and the Reich was enough to quickly clean up the revolt and end the unrest on the island. They risked annihilation so that 2 or 3 truths might cast their essential light on the world. With the early phases of his reforms complete, the military being sufficiently pacified and the people being sufficiently on his side, the time had come for Speer to start reforming the economy of the Reich. He would push away from the economy of conquest that Göring and Hitler had supported, creating a more free market, though not entirely unrestricted, opening the market to neutral European states, and scaling back military production to free up more resources for the civilian population. Despite his reforms, however, it seemed that it had all been for naught. Hitler was declining fast, and he had been in a coma for the last few months. On October 17th, 1963, the Führer of the Reich, Adolf Hitler, would pass away. A few days later, his funeral would be held, a painfully quick ceremony with brief speeches and tense undertones. After this, everything went down fast. Heydrich would make his move, securing the Alsace and Prussia as his own fiefdom, the SS in Burgundy behind him supporting his hardliner stance. Speer would declare independence right after, with students rallying behind him in the northeast. Goering would declare his own sovereignty, claiming Schleswig-Holstein and a majority of the northeast as his territory. Everything else, outside of Germania and Brandenburg, would fall under the command of Bormann. By October 27th, civil war had begun. Speer did not waste time, immediately moving to capture the Schleswig-Holstein region from Goering. Success in this endeavor would prove his legitimacy, hurting the morale of not just Hermann Goering, but every other rival within the bloody struggle. Luckily for him, the capture of Schleswig-Holstein was clean and easy, with the poorly organized militias failing to counter the morale and might of Speer's army. Goering was the leader of the Luftwaffe, not the Wehrmacht. Kiel, Lübeck, and Flensburg would all fall in a matter of days, shattering Goering's pride and forcing him to act on defense, though that mostly failed anyway. With the immediate threat in the north wiped away, Speer turned south. Despite Heydrich's initial claim only including the Alsace, he had managed to gain much more territory, the southern Rhine and Luxembourg. In order to make sure that Heydrich did not manage to seize anything more, strengthening his army and creating a much greater threat to reformism within the Reich, Speer would make a preemptive strike. Another offensive, and another smashing success. Saarbrücken and Trier would fall within weeks, massacring Heydrich's SS and the legitimacy of his claim to be in command of Germany. With the students behind him, Speer and his faction was gaining traction and might, with many forces across the world attempting to help him out, most important of which being the United States. Due to his earlier rapprochement with America, he had managed to secure aid for his army, strengthening reformism within Germany and giving Speer a chance. Although guns and aid were not enough, Speer needed men. Because of this, over the course of the Civil War, he would begin making promises to different groups in order to get them to take up arms and join his fight to bring reform to Germany. No longer would speaking political thoughts outside of Nazism be called dissidence. No longer would petty acts against the Reich have you be called a criminal. No longer would the Reich maintain such evil practices as slavery, on paper at least, and no longer would what you had done under Hitler give you a status under Speer. Take up arms, and you shall be forgiven. With manpower secured, Speer would continue his struggle to liberate Germany from moderation and hardliner elements, as well as the militarists, though they were already weak. Speer would authorize an offensive to capture Leipzig, the administrative capital of Bormann's Germany. Though not exactly a massive city on its own, the city had rich cultural and trade value, which was what convinced Bormann to designate it as the capital of his Reich. Taking over the city would be a massive blow to Bormann's legitimacy, giving Speer yet another victory under his belt, and likely leading to the death tolls beginning to ring for his opponents. After seizing Leipzig, Speer would turn his eyes to the north once again, beginning to push Goering back even further. An offensive was made to capture the states of Mecklenburg and Pommern, cutting Goering off from the north and severing outside aid, though very few people were aiding Hermann Goering in the first place. Much like his earlier campaign in Schleswig-Holstein, the offensive through Pommern would be a massive success, with the region quickly falling under his authority. With Goering effectively crippled, Speer would focus his efforts on Bormann once again, beginning an offensive to capture Dresden and Nuremberg, not only crippling Bormann like he did to Goering, but also opening up another front to ensure that the militarists would be encircled and destroyed like they deserved. Whilst the offensive saw more pushback than those before it, seeing as Bormann easily had the largest army of his contenders, and though it was demoralizing, weak from Speer's previous successes, it would still be a resounding success, with Speer capturing both cities, creating a second front to destroy Goering, and spelling disaster for Bormann's already non-existent legitimacy. It was now time for Albert Speer to shift his efforts to the northeast, where Reinhard Heydrich was stubbornly holding on to Prussia. Although many within the faction believed that it would take much more effort to do, the region fell quickly, with Heydrich's support among the Reich being minimal and Himmler being rather cautious on sending a sinking ship any aid. From there was little opposition to Speer's dominance, and thus the offensive was no longer to strategically capture cities and wear down the resistance of his rivals, but to crush them with the full might of reformism. That was not a particularly difficult effort, with Heydrich's army being encircled within the Alsace and Bormann being demoralized and unwilling to fight all too hard. Ultimately, within just a few months, Speer had reformed the Reich into his own vision, saving it from conservatism and the Burgundian system, as well as whatever the hell Goering was doing. The only thing standing between Speer and unification was Speer, a general responsible for ensuring that Germany wasn't utterly slaughtered in the West Russian War. He had been elected by Germania to ensure neutrality within the Civil War. Now, nothing more than a bird in a locked cage, Speer would take the only option he had that could save his ass and surrender to Speer, with the last piece of the puzzle that was reunited Germany being solved peacefully. Speer had won. Reform had won. The students had won. But victory did not mean prosperity. That would have to be built. I can't even. Another offensive and another smash. Another offensive and another smash. What the fuck? Another offensive and another smash. Fuck off. He would also spend time working with major. He would also spend time working with major members of the earlier student protests, promising a better future under a Reich headed by Speer, pushing a pension reform through the United. What the fuck?